Hello, welcome to this, our webinar on the transformational impacts of a forest carbon offset program in Uganda, lessons from a 10-year investigation of the Trees for Global Benefits program. We'll wait a minute or two for colleagues and participants to arrive. I will also initiate the screen share. I'm Professor Mark Purdon, bienvenue, and I'm joined here by my colleague, Professor Patrick Byakagaba from Makerere University in Uganda.
Hello.
We'll wait another minute or two as participants arrive. So we have a number already. This is a research project that Professor Byakagaba and I have been working on for a good 3, maybe 3.5 years, including a lot of field work spent in Uganda. We had a great team of students of Professor Byakagaba who were involved with us. And it's really exciting to be able to present these results. I don't know if Professor Byakagaba, if you wanted to introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, sure. My name is Patrick Byakagaba, as Mark has mentioned. I'm formerly employed in the Department of Environmental Management here at Makerere University, and my area of expertise is in environmental governance. Originally, I studied forestry, then natural resource management, and later on forestry again, mainly forestry governance. And I've been focusing a lot on the political ecology of some of these carbon projects. And yeah, and I'm from Uganda. I think that's also very important. Thank you. Looking forward to the engagement we shall have here.
Before I launch into the presentation, I'll just note that we have a working paper that we will make available later today, finding the time to coordinate the Zoom webinar and the upload of the paper. But the working paper is complete, and we'll be uploading that shortly. The working paper is a working paper series that we've started here at the chair in decarbonization, the chair sur la décarbonisation here at UQAM. And I think it's important as to understand that it's a research paper that we intend on submitting to a peer-reviewed journal. We've been able to, however, sort of trying to build some dialogue and get results out there. With also some quality controls. The paper has been reviewed internally by an expert here at the chair to provide some independent review. And we really appreciate that type of input. So I'm just going to start the presentation. It's going to be recorded and will be available on YouTube afterwards. As we continue to engage on this project. So without further ado, we'll get into it. The plan of the presentation will provide a bit of introduction and context on why this issue of transformational change in this project in particular is of interest. We'll then go over our research question, talk a bit more about transformational change, and why this is important. We will then discuss in more detail the TFGB program. That's the acronym we use for this carbon offset program, the Trees for Global Benefits program. And we'll also talk about some of the previous research that has been undertaken into this carbon offset program. Then we'll discuss the research methodology that we have used, then talk about our results, discussion, and conclusion. I anticipate that the presentation may take about 25 or 30 minutes. So just maybe some introduction context. When we're talking about forest management in developing countries, we know that there are a number of challenges. Land tenure security is often a key challenge. There are also concerns about how the benefits that might be generated from forest management activities might be shared with community members, particularly rural smallholders and rural communities. And there's also concerns about biodiversity and biodiversity loss. And really these issues are very much entwined. At the same time, there's been a lot of interest in the political science literature and development literature about transnational climate change governance. And this is, we might define as cross-border climate governance initiatives catalyzed by non-state actors. So NGOs, the private sector, subnational governments like cities. But I think the people doing research in this area would agree that policy effectiveness, the effectiveness of some of these initiatives has only recently attracted empirical attention. So it's something that we're able to contribute here because this transformation, this carbon offset program that we're investigating is on the voluntary market, which means it's created by NGOs and who source revenues from the private sector largely. So it's a good example of transnational climate governance. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And then there's also this issue of transformational change. This has become an important paradigm in the policy studies and political science and governance literatures. It's been, for example, in the recent IPCC Assessment Report 6, Working Group 3 report that was released just a few weeks ago, there are a number of references to transformational change. And we'll get into some of the debates about what transformational change is, but there are really some important ones between how to measure it, what it is, and also the relationship between incremental and transformational change. And I really should, just to facilitate the management of the PowerPoint presentation, I'll speak to the slide, but Professor Byakagaba is really an expert on forest management in Uganda, and I'm sure he'd be able to contribute much more here. I just wanted to introduce that there are high deforestation rates in Uganda. There's a significant population living in rural areas whose main occupation is smallholder farming. Also, the forest industry in Uganda is highly underdeveloped, and timber reserves are relatively low. Partly this is due to the fact that trees take a long time to grow and mature, about 20 years, I understand. But there's been some problems with in Uganda's recent history. So some of the timber plantations that we might take for granted in developed countries are rather underdeveloped. This is improving, and I'm sure Professor Byakagaba can speak to that. But there's sort of insufficient timber reserves in Uganda right now, as I understand it. Related to this, there is also a challenge of encroachment on public lands. And now you'll note I put encroachment in quotation marks, and that's because encroachment is sort of a loaded term. It depends on whether it's related to issues of land tenure security, and it's related to if rural dwellers who are maybe using land that the central government has deemed a central forest reserve are encroaching on that land, or if they have been using that land and that land has been acquired or had been maintained by the central government in a complex fashion that maybe is not respecting those encroachers' land use rights, and maybe the term encroachment is actually inappropriate. But this is a very, very complex issue, and it's something that this Trees for Global Benefits program is actually trying to avoid by working with smallholders directly. The other thing about forest management in Uganda is the recognition, the legal recognition of quasi-private customary land tenure. We use this term because we don't have private land. What we call quasi-private customary land tenure is somewhat more individualized land tenure systems, not in all of Uganda, but it's something that is prevalent in the part of Uganda that we were investigating. And this type of land tenure regime is actually recognized in Uganda's constitution, which is quite unique in sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, and this is maybe a good segue to our investigation, there are a number of forest carbon offset projects in Uganda, but under a number of different standards. So there are different carbon standards. There's the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, which many people may know. The specific standard that is being used to govern the Trees for Global Benefits project is the Plan Vivo standard. There's a few of these, and there's some important differences between the two. And it makes, for this reason, again, it's actually attracted a considerable amount of research interest into these types of climate governance initiatives. So what our research question, if I can turn to our research question, is what are the transformational impacts of the Trees for Global Benefits program, the TFG program? And as I noted, it's operating under the Plan Vivo standard. So this is a pretty big research question. So let's maybe unpack it by just getting back into this issue of transformational change. So the IPCC in their recent report, they define transformational change as a concept embracing the idea of major fundamental changes in society or natural systems, as opposed to changes that are minor, marginal, or incremental. There is an emerging literature on transformational change, and I think there's a consensus that there are at least 3 characteristics of transformational change: speed, scale, and entrenchment. And there's also recognition that there's tension between these characteristics. For example, there may be a trade-off between speed and the entrenchment of a climate governance initiative. But there's also this, as I suggested earlier, there's a real interest in the relationship between incremental change and transformational change. And one of the exciting areas of transnational climate governance is the idea and the possibility that incremental changes might accumulate and produce transformational change. I think the thing that we wanted to dwell on or focus on in this presentation is this idea of entrenchment. And this is arguably, sorry for the difficult character of research, which is longitudinal in nature, is helpful. I have a sign that my internet connection is stable. I hope it's okay. If Fabrice or Patrick could give me a thumbs up, that would be great. But I'll just keep going.
We lost you for 10 seconds, but you're back.
Okay. Well, okay. So just to say again that entrenchment is, I think, one of the most difficult facets of transformational change to measure, but it's also where this type of longitudinal research that we're going to present today is really important. There are different, we can maybe dive a bit deeper into entrenchment, and entrenchment is difficult to measure because it's associated with path-dependent processes that are not so easy to measure, without kind of diving into the details of a specific intervention. The literature suggests 4 processes, and I think one of our contributions of this paper is that we might add a 5th, positive spillovers. But these processes, and maybe will resonate with you. I don't want to dwell too long on the slide. There's a lot more in the paper, but we might talk about positive lock-in, self-reinforcement, increase in returns, positive feedbacks, and then this idea of positive spillovers. Positive spillovers is something that we're kind of adding to this discussion on entrenchment, because most of the other policy processes tend to focus on the targeted populations and the benefits to the targeted populations. And what we see is that there's one of the interesting things is the relationship between the targeted population, so the participants in the TFG program, and the untargeted populations, and how they might benefit from the program. So those are those local residents in Uganda who are unable to participate in the TFG program. So now we shift to the TFG program itself, with that overview of transformational change complete. And there are a number of innovations of the TFG program. The first is that it works with smallholders directly on household lands in order to minimize land tenure risks. That's where this concept of the Plan Vivo emerges. This is really a household land use planning exercise. The other innovation is upfront carbon payments. And the TFG program delivers 70% of carbon payments during the first 3 years of participation. So household starts in the program, and during the first 3 years, they might get 70% of the total carbon payments. But those carbon payments are concluded by the 10th year of participation. And the idea is that by the 10th year, the trees will be mature enough that participants in the program will see the value added of keeping those trees through to maturity, and that they can be harvested by the 20th year or 25th year, it depends, and generate even more revenue for the participants in the program. We also highlight here that carbon payments in the TFG program are in 2019 were $6 per ton CO2. We could talk about how those prices compare to other carbon prices around the world, but that $6 per ton is actually pretty good for what we see on the voluntary carbon markets, which are averaging about $3 per ton. A third innovation, the TFG program promotes establishment of native tree species. So one of the critiques of a lot of CDM projects that have existed in sub-Saharan Africa is they plant exotic species like eucalyptus and pine. I know I remember driving through Tanzania and visiting a CDM project there during my PhD and being surprised that it was like being in Canada. It was a pine forest. Another innovation of the TFG program is the establishment of a carbon community fund. Smallholders are required to contribute 10% of their carbon payments into this fund. Of that fund, only about 30% is directed to community development, and 70% is directed to the risk that smallholders will have to leave the program or want to leave the program, and they might need to be replaced or somehow compensated for. And I will also note, it's not on this list, that the Eco Trust, the Uganda NGO responsible for the program, also sets beside 10% of carbon credits generated through the program as a buffer account. So that's another way to hedge against risks. So does the TFG program constitute transformational change? Well, in terms of speed and scale, it is very suggestive that it is being transformative. Between 2003 and 2020, nearly 12,000 households across 12 districts of Uganda have participated in the program. Over 9,000 hectares of household land, 1.95 million tons of CO2 emission removals have been generated, and it's paid out about $3.4 million to participants. So that's quite impressive, and you can see in those graphs that it seems to be taking off. But there is this question of entrenchment, and I think that's where our value added is. these questions that we are interested in is sort of the local livelihood benefits and the transformational impacts at the local level, is a new kind of framing or approach to thinking about this carbon offset program. But there has been, we're not the first or the only to investigate this project. There have been a number of research efforts into this in this carbon forest program, and we can distinguish them into 4 theoretical frameworks: skewed benefits, discount theory, subsumption theory, environmental justice. They all rely on different methodological approaches, qualitative and quantitative. And I'll have another slide to discuss these in a bit more detail. But I think the important thing to stress in this presentation is that most of this previous research has been based on sort of a single field visit. And what's really unique about the research that we're presenting today is this longitudinal research where we're comparing results from 2019 with those first collected in 2009. So here's a paper, and it's elaborated in much more detail in the working paper. But there is these 4 theoretical frameworks. And one of the challenges and one of the innovations of the paper is we try to interpret these theoretical frameworks in terms of the implicit hypotheses about transformational change in each. Now, these papers the previous research has not approached the issue of this TFG program from the perspective of transformational change, so it's not a perfect fit. But I think that there are some conceptual innovations we gain from this type of overview approach and attempt to synthesize. Briefly, what I could say is that I think all the previous research has identified challenges with the TFG program, but some have been much more critical of the TFG program than others. The most critical has been subsumption theory, which sort of its main conclusion is that global capitalism is subsuming smallholder farmers into carbon farmers, which generates all sorts of struggles and associated grievances that are an obstacle to implementation and result in declining program performance. Some other concerns have been raised about the program from an environmental justice perspective. Of the carbon offset projects in Uganda, experts who have used this theoretical framework have recognized that relative to other carbon offset programs in the country, the TFG program is perhaps weakly positive, but it's most weak in terms of procedural justice. But another theory, discount theory, is elaborated about raises concerns about the long-term effects of participation in TFG program, and that the TFG program may lure smallholders to allocate household land towards the project in an unsustainable manner. And that's because people in developing countries tend to have higher discount rates, and they appreciate the immediate benefits of those upfront carbon payments, and they kind of discount the future costs that might emerge further down the road. And then there's this research, including some of my own previous research about the skewed benefits resulting from the program, in the sense that it really tends to benefit smallholders of relatively higher socioeconomic status who are able to participate in the program, because there's a eligibility criteria of the TFG program that you have 1 hectare of land to participate, and that is done for justifiable reasons and concerns about food security. But the poorest of the poor don't have that 1 hectare of land, and that results in a skewing of benefits. We try to map these theoretical frameworks onto different path-dependent processes, but we'll let you go in the paper to kind of look at that in more detail. So going back to the research question, the methodology we use to answer it was this comparative quasi-experimental longitudinal approach. We compared 2019 results data with that first collected in 2009. Perhaps a bit more background on the actual study area. If you don't know where Uganda is, it's in East Africa, bordering. We're in southwestern Uganda, bordering on the Congo. We have some nice views of the Congo from Uganda. While we're there, we have at least one photo in here. But we investigated 2 districts, Mutuma and Rubirizi, and these were really areas where the TFG program was started in 2003. So we have a long history there. Actually, it was started in Buteriko sub-county of what was then Busheni district, and Busheni was divided into a number of smaller districts, including a smaller Busheni district, Mutuma, and Rubirizi, I believe, in 2010. So there's that sort of recent political history. But you can see some of the photos of Mutuma and Rubirizi. Mutuma is a bit more accessible, a bit more a long-term, people have living in the area for a bit longer time. Rubirizi is a bit more elevated on an escarpment, and a more recently settled part of Uganda. They're not very far from one another, nonetheless, just maybe a day's drive between both of these districts. And just sort of, we talked about the quasi-private customary land tenure previously, and it's interesting. If you look closely in the Mutuma photo, you'll see a fence and a pasture with some cows. So it's just this idea of how we think about customary land tenure in different parts of Africa. There are some quasi-private, not fully private, like freehold, but approaching some of the characteristics of that in this part of Uganda. So what do we actually do in terms of methodology and analysis? Well, we had we can distinguish between quantitative and qualitative methods. We report on both results from both of these in this presentation and in the working paper. At the core of the quantitative methods were a total of 250 household surveys. These were undertaken with participants in the TFG program, as well as neighboring non-participants. And so we went with a team of researchers, 2019, replicating research I did with the field assistant. Actually, we had the same field assistant assisted me in 2019. In 2009, was on the team in 2019, and that was really excellent. But we had about equal participation of participants and non-participants. About 60 households surveyed in 2009, and about 100, and the remainder is in 2019. Data collected, well, we collected information on livelihoods, including income, land use, food security. I'll emphasize that our team, everyone spoke the local languages, and that really facilitated kind of getting this type of detailed household information. We also have 3 measures of participant satisfaction with the program. One was about a cost, sort of a simple cost benefit analysis evaluation. But others were sort of questions about whether people want to continue in the program, and how, would they keep trees after carbon payments ceased. To analyze this information, we use multiple regression analysis to really try and isolate the effect of participation in the carbon offset program on some of these livelihood measurements and measurements of participant satisfaction. We have dummy variables for treatment year, district, as well as the interaction effect of treatment times year. Ideally, we would have aspired to do a difference in difference analysis, which is sort of a classic kind of quasi-experiment for demonstrating the causal impact of a policy intervention. But that requires you to have data from before and after the intervention. And we don't have that before data available to us because the project started in 2003 and the first time I was there was in 2009. So we don't have that before data, but we maintain this interaction effect because it produces some interesting results. Another element that renders this project quasi-experimental is that we control for household income and household land. So really, and the reason for that is because we know that participants in the program tend to be of higher income and have also more land. So we try to control for that and isolate that from the treatment effect in the statistical analysis. We also did interviews with key informants. A number were interviewed in the districts, in the communities themselves, in the district capitals, and also in Kampala, Uganda's capital. A few photos. We can see some of the trees being planted. There's sort of, you can see some pines in one, but I think those are pines from another forestry project, and the owner was also involved with the TFG program and planting adjacent to those pine trees. The TFG program also, to some households, they distributed cook stoves as another kind of benefit of participating in the program. And Patrick, you're there in the center, gazing up at that one tree. So, getting into the results, I thought I'd start with the descriptive statistics of livelihood variables. And there's a lot of information here. We can come back to it if you like. It's also all in the working paper. But if you can look at the final two columns on the right, you see that it distinguishes between participants and non-participants. And we see that participants seem to have higher incomes, greater land, more cultivated land, more fallow land. There's no non-participants with planting TFGB trees, which is interesting. It kind of demonstrates the additionality of this type of carbon offset program in the sense that it's really incentivizing landowners to plant trees, these TFGB trees. We also see more exotic tree planting amongst participants, slightly more banana. It's not clear. I don't think that comes out as significant, and slightly more coffee. Food security is also lower amongst participants in the program. We have two measures of food security. Unfortunately, the question changed slightly, so we had to separate them. But you can see that food security tends to be lower food security is greater amongst the participants, and food insecurity is greater amongst non-participants. But let's get into the results for multiple regression. We have the regression tables in the appendix on this PowerPoint, and we can go to that, but I think it's helpful to break things down textually. So in terms of household income and household land, participation in TFG programs was significantly associated with greater household income and household land, so that kind of confirms some of that. There's no relationship with the interaction term. Crop cultivation and land use practices. Well, we see participation in the TFG program. That criteria was positively associated with planting indigenous TFGB trees, so that result is significant. But the interaction term was actually interesting because you see a reduction in coffee cultivation and fallow land over time amongst TFG participants to a greater degree than amongst non-participants. And why this is important is to suggest that the TFG program tree planting of TFG trees was competing with coffee production. And also it was sort of an alternative land use from leaving land fallow. That so it was maybe a way of using fallow land and using it to generate some revenue. Food security, there was no relationship between participation in the carbon offset program and food security, which is good in the sense that it confirms that there's no food security risks associated with the program. Turning to these measures of participant satisfaction, this is where I think some more concerns arise. We have this cost benefit scale, which is not terribly significant. But the two questions about would you like to continue planting more carbon TFGB trees? And we see a sharp reduction from 87% 2009 to 57% 2019, slightly more, slightly less in Rubarisi than in Tuma. And would you keep the trees standing if carbon payments stop? We see a sharp reduction. Everyone basically said yes, they would keep the trees even if carbon payments stopped in 2009. We see a sharp reduction to 47% in 2019. Limited differences between districts, I think, here. In terms of the multiple progression results, one of the interesting things here is that participant evaluations that benefits exceed costs were associated with greater household income. And this is interesting because it speaks to this idea in discount theory that poor participants are going to have higher discount rates than relatively wealthier participants, which would make them more sensitive to sort of the increasing costs over time, and that's reflected in this cost benefit index result. Whether TFG participant would be interested in continuing with the program in the future, and there's a significant reduction between sampling years, and then this whether they would keep trees standing or harvest them after carbon payments ceased, which they're not supposed to do. They're supposed to wait until the 20 or 25th year to harvest, and there is a significant decline over time, but also significantly lower responses in Tuma. So some concerns on that level. But as we also indicated, we did some qualitative interviews, and we noted a change, some important changes in program governance and management over time. Some of these suggest a greater burden for smallholders, and this is important because that kind of corresponds to one of the key arguments of subsumption theory, that there is a greater burden being placed on smallholders as EcoTrust, the NGO managing the program, was being pressured to really kind of clamp down and discipline the smaller farmers. However, some of the changes have really been to the benefit of smallholder farmers. And the most important one we saw was that it transpired around 2015, 2016. And essentially what happened is that the monitoring of the TFG program is largely based on visits, revolves around visits by a EcoTrust district program assistant. And a lot of TFG participants that we interviewed in these two districts, and we heard this from a number of different people, found that new district program assistant who came in 2015 was applying the standard much too strictly relative to the previous program assistant. And EcoTrust complied and replaced that individual, that program assistant, to the benefit of the participants. And more recently, in 2019, EcoTrust was developing a smartphone application to simplify field data collection and carbon payments. something that needs to be appreciated about this project is you're working with individual smallholders that are diffused across the relatively large areas, and it is administratively very complex. And so I think these district program assistants were going in the field with like a motorcycle and visiting, going household to household in sort of rural parts of Uganda. That one Ruberizi district is sort of on mountainous terrain. The roads aren't always accessible and feasible to access. So there's a lot of challenges about going up with all this paperwork and collecting all this data by paper, and then taking it back to the office, verifying it, entering into a database, and making sure that that gets transferred to carbon payment. So the smartphone application, I think, is quite innovative. It wasn't being implemented while we were there in 2019. It was only being developed, but I think it's been implemented since. So what does this mean in terms of transformational impact? So what I think could say is that the program has delivered benefits, but has not been as transformative as expected. And what we're trying to introduce here is this concept of positive but declining returns for TFG participants. This is we're trying the transformational change those path-dependent processes and entrenchment, sort of make a distinction between increasing returns, and of course the opposite of that is diminishing returns. But what we see is that there's positive returns, maybe not exponentially increasing, but the returns are sort of declining in the sense that the costs are becoming more apparent as time moves on, and the costs become more apparent when carbon payments cease at the 10th year, and all of a sudden the participants are a bit kind of, maybe that kind of carbon payment schedule is not fully appreciated, maybe insufficiently communicated, but there's some sort of realization that the carbon money has stopped, but we still have these trees. And there's this gap, there's this 10-year gap, 10 to 15-year gap before those trees can be harvested per their carbon contracts. So this maps onto this idea of decline dissatisfaction over time. It's 100% satisfaction in 2009 for one of those questions about participant satisfaction, and that drops to 50% by 2019. So not everyone is dissatisfied, but there's an important drop in satisfaction. And this seems to be consistent with discount theory, but also attribute to that gap between carbon payments and project completion timber harvesting. And it's somewhat different from this concept of increasing returns and diminishing returns. That maybe is something to be considered. Another finding is that there's been limited positive feedbacks and spillovers. Benefits still largely accrue to relatively better off farmers. That the real absence of the significant interaction effect between treatment and year suggests that really what's happening is smallholders that are participating in the program are those with surplus land who self-select to participate in order to diversify their livelihoods. And the program is, because of sort of the livelihood, the concerns about food security and the restrictions on land, minimum land requirements to participate, sort of make it difficult to get to the poorest of the poor. But then the Carbon Community Fund, with 10% contributions by the smallholders and only 30% of that fund going to smallholders, it's not as transformative, and really limits the spillovers and benefits being exchanged with non-participants. Reflecting on some of the previous research, I think that some of the implicit hypothesis and path-dependent processes of transformative change. Some of these theoretical frameworks are valid, especially the skewed benefits and discount theory seem to really resonate with what we've seen. Moving on, subsumption theory, I think it's highly questionable, mostly because the causal impact, the finding that governance has improved is really not anticipated in subsumption theory. It only anticipates sort of a decline, so it suggests that there's some problems with that, the causal mechanism of that theory. Environmental justice, I think, it's a quite interesting theoretical framework, but it seems that one of the limitations is that, again, the procedural justice, which seemed to be that there maybe was limited accountability to smallholders, we found strong evidence that they did have, participants did have voice, and EcoTrust did respond to that. So it suggests some of the procedural justice's concerns are, I wouldn't say misplaced, but maybe what we try and suggest in the paper is that the possibility for policy learning needs to be integrated into such series of environmental justice, because it seems like things have improved and people can learn about the need for improving the governance of these types of regimes. Finally, turning to recommendations about how to improve the transformational impact. The research, I think, that we've conducted and really validating which of those theoretical frameworks is most important. It allows us to kind of really determine what causal mechanisms are responsible for some of the declining satisfaction with the program over time. It allows us to identify some opportunities for addressing those. And I think the most important one is that EcoTrust should consider upfront payments for timber harvesting and replanting operations for the 10 to 15 years remaining on carbon contracts. Uganda, especially this part of Uganda, is perhaps not a long tradition or much of a tradition with sustainable timber harvesting. I don't think there's and maybe Patrick can confirm this, I don't think there's a forest processing plant or timber mill or paper mill in Uganda still. So there isn't that, okay, this timber, we can harvest it and do something with it. That is something that needs still to be developed in this part of Uganda, if not nationally. But maybe other payments for ecosystem services might be also considered, honey, some, if some of the trees are contributing to water retention or other types of ecosystem services, maybe that could also be compensated. And if this is done in a smart way, it might, we'll pay you, for example, or these timber, give you a upfront payment on your timber, but you need to honor the contract to keep that those trees growing for another 10 years. So that could kind of address some of those discount theory concerns. In terms of increasing positive spillovers, we would suggest that EcoTrust consider revising their requirements to enable greater participation while ensuring food security. This might be by allowing for communities to seek access to state-owned forests like central forest reserves. And so people that don't have maybe household lands could maybe plant TFGB carbon trees in these central forest reserves and gain from benefit from that. And also EcoTrust could also directly contribute to this carbon community fund to increase benefits flowing into the communities where it operates. It's been a very challenging time on the voluntary carbon market and cross carbon markets generally for some time. But I think one of the interesting developments just since last year in Glasgow was we saw a real increase in interest in carbon markets. I know the carbon market in Quebec here, the prices have increased significantly just over 2021, as now the UN climate change regime has recognized that, UNFCCC has recognized that these types of carbon market instruments are appropriate tools, legitimate tools for addressing the climate challenge. So conclusions. While the program has delivered benefits, it has not been as transformative as expected, positive but declining returns, limited positive feedback and spillovers. Such processes are associated with two theoretical frameworks previously used to interpret the TFGB program, skewed benefits and discount theory, but they also highlight the gap between the completion of upfront carbon payments by the 10th year of the participation in the program and that gap before timber harvesting can take place. And we've also made a number of recommendations that may allow for the transformational impact of the TFGB program to be more fully realized. So thank you very much, and I appreciate everyone staying in for this presentation. I guess we'll first see if there are any questions and open the floor to discussion. Maybe first allow Patrick, Professor Byakagaba to maybe add his thoughts.
I think you ably represented my views in there. I can only, oops, my camera is not on, sorry. You've ably represented my views in the presentation. I can only add on the slide where we had forest management status here, that Uganda has had very high rates of deforestation, nearly up to 2.4% of forest cover lost annually. On average, we've been losing nearly 90,000 hectares, between 90,000 and 120,000 hectares annually. And so we're running out of natural forests because of deforestation. So projects similar to this program that promote growing of indigenous tree species are helping us in creating landscapes with indigenous tree species which mimic our natural forests. So in terms of additionality, I thought we could maybe emphasize this. Thank you.